The Foreign Office, November the 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur Balfour.
This is Dan Dix here reporting for Press for Truth. What you just heard was a reading of the Declaration of Balfour by Lord Jacob Rothschild in a very recent interview he just gave just a few months ago here in 2017, where he discussed his family's role in the formation of Israel as a nation. And in today's video, we're going to talk about how this agenda has been on the table not just for decades, but in fact for centuries. Now, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here today when I say that the Rothschilds are an incredibly wealthy, powerful, and secretive family, and they are consumed by an all-out lust for power and control. Behind the scenes, they have been manipulating our finances and our politics, and with the ability to issue currency that is created out of thin air and then loaned to governments at interest, it is through this process that they manage to emerge on the very top of this pyramidal structure of power. But one thing I don't think very many people are aware of is the fact that this plan has been in the works for not just decades, but in fact centuries, and I am in possession of a document that can help substantiate that claim. What I'm holding right here in my hands is an original document. This was printed on November 28th, 1829. This is a Niles Weekly Register. And remember, this came out at a time when the press and the media was not as controlled as it is today. So researchers and journalists were able to put this kind of information out there. And the info contained herein suggests that the Rothschilds purchased Jerusalem and they had big plans in store for that landmass. So I'm just going to pick up the camera here and we'll read this to you. All right, guys, so this is the paper in question. This is a Niles Weekly Register. And bear in mind, this was printed in 1829. Unbelievable that they were able to put this kind of information out there back then, but as we said, they weren't as controlled as we are today. So, let's have a look at what they had to say here. I'm going to very carefully open this up because, as I said, this is an original document from 1829. And here is the article. I'll read it to you now. Jerusalem. There is a report that the Rothschilds have purchased Jerusalem. We see nothing improbable that in the pecuniary distress of the Sultan, he should sell some part of his dominions to preserve the rest, or that the Rothschilds should purchase the ancient capital of their nation. They are wealthy beyond desire, perhaps even avarice, and so situated is quite reasonable to suppose that they may seek something else to gratify their ambitions that shall produce most important effects. If secured in the possession, and which may be brought about by money, they might instantly, as it were, gather a large nation together, soon to become capable of defending itself and having a wonderful influence over the commerce and the conditions of the East, rendering Judea again the place of a deposit of the large portion of the wealth of the ancient world. To the Sultan, the contrary is of no great value, but in the hands of the Jews, directed by such men as the Rothschilds, what might it not become, and in a short period of time? The Sultan is in great difficulty. Baron Rothschild was proceeding to Constantinople, and a second rebuilding of the temple is not among some of the most strange things expected in these strange times by some of the Jews. So there you have it, folks. The Rothschilds purchased Jerusalem, and as has been confirmed in this recent interview, they also formed the nation of Israel as we know it today. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section below. It's pretty interesting stuff, especially when you consider that the reformation of Israel as a nation was foretold in the Bible. This was written about even as much as 3,500 years ago. So are the Rothschilds just playing on that, or what do you think is going on here? Now, as always, my friends, share this video if you found the information useful. And this channel is only made possible by you, the viewers. So thank you so much to anyone who has ever donated or contributed by becoming either a PFT member or a PFT patron. And stay tuned, folks. We're going to have more video reports coming soon. This is Dan Dix reporting for Press for Truth.
We already know that modern-day Israel, at least in an earthly sense, had a lot to do with the efforts of the Rothschilds. Some more symbolism that gives that away can be found in the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court was funded by the Rothschilds on the condition that they would choose the plot of land, would use their own architect, and that the price of its construction would never be made public. Built in 1992 in Jerusalem, it sits next to the Knesset, which is the main political building in Israel. Also funded by the Rothschilds, the Knesset is the legislative branch of the Israeli government, where laws are enacted and heads of state are elected. Here's the picture of the Supreme Court. This painting is at the entrance to the building and depicts the Rothschilds planning its design along with Shimon Peres and Isaac Rabin. A journey through the Supreme Court esoterically represents a path towards illumination. The ultimate goal of the journey is to reach this pyramid, which represents the most holy place in the building. Each side of the pyramid has a circular hole at the top representing the all-seeing eye. Let's do a picture walkthrough along this so-called path of illumination from the beginning, and do some symbol spotting along the way. Firstly, the person who enters the Supreme Court finds himself in a dark area in front of a stairway leading to a source of light at the other end. By climbing these stairs, the visitor gradually moves away from the darkness towards illumination. There are exactly 3 sets of 10 steps equaling 30 overall. These represent the first 30 degrees of Freemasonry. Since there are 33 degrees to Freemasonry overall, we will discover where the remaining 3 are later. You'll notice that the right side of the wall is made from rough old rocks, reminiscent of ancient Jerusalem walls, while the left is smooth and modern. This represents the timeless nature of the occult teachings that have been transmitted from ancient Babylon to today, and is a repeated theme throughout the Supreme Court. Having climbed the steps, the visitor finds that he is on a high point with a great view over the rooftops of Jerusalem. We know that Satan wants to try and claim the high points in a region because he wants to be the most high, so no further explanation is required here. Embedded on the floor is a line which guides the traveller to the entrance of the library, which is placed right underneath the Great Pyramid. This is the path you walk to the holiest place, and of course the library itself represents knowledge. This picture is taken from the 2nd floor of that library. The library is actually divided into 3 levels, symbolically representing the final 3 degrees of Freemasonry. The first level is reserved for lawyers only, the second is reserved for judges only, and the books on the 3rd level can only be read by retired judges. This represents the movement through the degrees, acquiring higher and higher knowledge. The library functions like all occult hierarchies, where some information is the exclusive privilege of a select few. These are the 3 levels of the library. Right above the 3rd level, representing the final degree of Freemasonry, there is this view of the pyramid. This is where the Freemasonry ends and the elite Illuminati begins. Directly beneath the apex of the pyramid is this geometric floor pattern, with a crystal embedded in the floor at the center. There are 6 squares representing the number of man, and each square of course has 4 sides, which is the number that represents the world. The crystal in the center lies directly under the apex of the pyramid. This is similar to the sun symbol embedded at the center of the Capitol crypt in Washington, D.C. The entrances to the courtrooms themselves look like this. They are said to resemble ancient Jewish tombs. Apparently in some Jewish tombs there were holes where the soul was supposed to leave. They have retained these holes in the courtrooms, perhaps to allow spirits to come and go in a similar manner. Again, notice the contrast between the old and the new here. The prison cells, the courtroom, and the judges' quarters are placed one on top of the other, symbolizing the tiered society as proposed by Plato and the Enlightenment thinkers. The ruling elite at the top, represented by the judges' quarters, the auxiliaries like the police and civil servants in the middle to enforce the decrees of those at the top, represented by the courtroom, and the massive ignorant prisoners below. This is one of the courtrooms. The judge is illuminated by a natural source of light at the far end, symbolically representing the light of the divine, guiding their wisdom. They retire to their quarters at the top tier to make a decision and then descend back to the courtroom below to bring their illuminating wisdom to the world. Now let's start making our way outside. No occult structure would be complete without the obligatory sexual symbols, and the steps outside the courtrooms provide this feature. Again, this needs little explanation. Once outside the building, we are then invited to visit the Dorothy Rothschild Grove. We find this plaque on the wall with the arrow. Alongside it, we also find this plaque, which also contains an all-seeing eye. Sorry about the quality of these, I couldn't find anything more clear-cut. When we follow the arrow, though, to the Dorothy Rothschild Grove, we find this monument, which is obviously an obelisk, an Ashtoreth pole. If we then go to the centre of the parking facilities from here, we find this shape on the ground. Now, some people have suggested that this represents a cross so that people can trample on it as they descend down the steps. I don't personally buy into this theory. To me, it just looks like a sun symbol. All these things, again, are just evidence of the Rothschilds' occult influence.
Said to control half the wealth of the world. As Rothschild biographer Derek Wilson explains, Rothschild critics have justification for their anxiety. The House of Rothschild is immensely more powerful than any financial empire that has ever preceded it, and it's able to control governments behind the scenes, secretly.
Economic power, political power go hand in hand, and it's like Mayor Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family in Germany said, "Give me control of a nation's monetary system, and I care not who writes their laws."
Nathan Rothschild in 1820 might have had more right to say that than any of his successors. The statement is more or less absurd. The Federal Reserve does not control the money supply. The Federal Reserve influences the supply.
To say that the Federal Reserve only influences the money supply is like saying a robber with a gun to your head is only influencing you to give him his money. And of course, if you give him your money, you may be spared your life, but here again, you don't have your money anymore.
There has been, in the last 30 or 40 years, a much greater international flavor to the activities of the Fed because the banking system has become global. And you could no longer regulate the U.S. money supply by simply via the domestic Federal Reserve banks.
The Federal Reserve controls the very heart of what's happening with money, because money answers everything. It's the one thing that everybody wants. And when you give a private institution a monopoly on the creation of this money, you vest total control in that institution.
If you have the money, you can get any law passed you want. So who do you care whether Bill Clinton is president or who is senator from New Jersey? It doesn't make any difference because you write a check and you get another senator.
One of the stickiest questions in this debate is this: just who owns the Federal Reserve?
The City of London set the whole thing up. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is principally owned by 5 merchant banks in London, chartered by the Bank of England.
Perhaps England, which many have considered a political satellite of the United States in recent years, is really the one pulling the strings of international policy.
It's not a matter of who owns the Fed, it's who controls it. The government has given the banks a monopoly, and then you see the Justice Department doing nothing about the bank mergers. A monopoly can only exist with government assistance, and they've given great assistance to the banking monopoly.
Perhaps the headiest allegation made against those who run the Federal Reserve is that they are responsible for 3 of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century: World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression.
Wars are very profitable. In fact, wars are probably the most profitable thing an international banker can be involved in. So consequently, throughout the last at least 300 years of North American and European history, you see incidents of international bankers backing both sides of a conflict.
They had been trying to have a war in Europe since 1885, but the central banks of Europe had already bankrupted all the nations of Europe. They had no money. The only money was here in the United States. In order to get that money, they had to put a central bank over on the American people.
It was sold as a way to bring stability to the American economy. Well, what happens just a little over a decade after the passage of the Fed? We see the biggest depression of this century in any case.
For the 16 months prior to the crash of '29, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply by 62%. Now, what was happening back then? Much like it's happening today. People were buying and selling, pledging and borrowing, thinking the good times would never end. And then at the time of the crash, they pulled the plug on the money supply, and the people who had pledged their stocks, their bonds, their homes, their cars, everything, they pledged their savings accounts, they lost it all.
Selling guns to one adversary while making loans to another is a common way these boys make their profits during war. And when profits begin sagging, people like Jacob Schiff, Max Warburg, and J.P. Morgan knew how to build them up again. Surprise, surprise, it's a documented fact that these fellows financed Trotsky and Lenin with billions in gold and credit to initiate the revolution in Russia. With Russia out of the war and America in, the conflict was extended by at least another 2 years. 2 more glorious years of gun sales and wartime bank loans, upon which to earn interest for many more years to come.
There is no question that war is a profit-making business. After World War I, Senator Gerald Nye held very famous hearings here in Washington where he dragged in some of the biggest bankers and industrialists and put them on the spot and just examined profits that were made by some of these major interests. War is a profit-making business. Anybody who says otherwise is a liar or a fool.
They were able to manipulate us into World War I, and as a matter of fact, the war stretched out for at least another 2 years beyond what it would have gone.
Just when you think you're ahead of the game, someone changes the rules.
They did this knowing, with malice aforethought, to strengthen their own profits and to build their own institutions, their own banking institutions.
Many people believe that virtually all of the wars of this century have been caused for reasons that benefit small financial groups, those that move in the sphere of influence of the Bilderberg and Trilateral Commission.
For an example, the war in the Balkans right now. Who's been providing Milosevic with arms and weapons? The Soviets have. Who has been financing the Soviet Union, their military industrial complex? The United States has. European bankers have. So the bankers have been financing both sides of every major conflict. Conflict brings progress, but controlled conflict brings controlled progress. Every major war, every major conflict, arms sales, loaning money to governments. You get their people to pay you interest back into the coffers of the bank, money that you created out of nothing.
Nobel Prize Milton Friedman claimed that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression by deliberately reducing the amount of money in circulation.
Depositors all over the country were frightened about the safety of their funds and rushed to withdraw them. There were runs, there were failures of banks by the droves, and all the time the Federal Reserve System stood idly by when it had the power and the duty and the responsibility to provide the cash that would have enabled the banks to meet the insistent demands of their depositors without closing their doors.
Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House